Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
In the annals of history, few events are as seared into the collective consciousness of humanity as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The prevailing narrative suggests that Japan, facing the unprecedented horror of nuclear devastation, had no choice but to surrender unconditionally to the Allies, thereby bringing an end to World War II. This explanation, while widely accepted, oversimplifies a complex web of political, military, and social factors that ultimately led to Japan's capitulation. The truth is that the atomic bombings, while devastating, were not the sole or even the primary cause of Japan's surrender. Instead, it was the Soviet Union's sudden and aggressive entry into the war against Japan that proved to be the decisive factor. This article delves into the intricate dynamics of Japan's wartime leadership, the geopolitical chess game played by the Allied powers, and the calculated decisions that ultimately brought the war to an end. The devastation wrought by the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unprecedented. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands of people. 3 days later, on August 9th, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki, resulting in further massive casualties. The sheer horror of these attacks led many to assume that Japan had surrendered out of sheer terror and hopelessness. However, evidence suggests that Japan's leaders did not react to the bombings with immediate shock or surrender. Rather, they continued their deliberations and were still determined to hold out, believing that they could negotiate better terms if they prolonged the war. Before the atomic bombings, Japan was already in a dire situation. Its economy was in shambles. Its cities had been devastated by relentless Allied firebombing campaigns, and its navy was virtually non-existent. The American naval blockade had cut off essential resources, and food shortages were becoming critical. Yet, despite these hardships, Japan's military leaders remained committed to their war strategy. The concept of ketsugo, decisive battle strategy, was deeply ingrained in their thinking, and they believed that a final, bloody confrontation on Japanese soil could force the Allies to agree to terms more favorable to Japan. The idea of unconditional surrender was unthinkable to many within the Japanese high command, as it threatened not only the nation's sovereignty, but also the survival of the emperor, who was revered as a living deity. While the United States had long been urging the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan, the timing of its entry proved to be far more consequential than the nuclear bombings. On August 8, 1945, just 2 days after Hiroshima was bombed, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. This offensive, executed with overwhelming force, shattered Japan's last remaining hope for a negotiated settlement. The Soviet assault was swift, effective, and utterly demoralizing. The Japanese forces stationed in Manchuria, who had been expecting a longer period of preparation, were caught completely off guard. The sheer speed of the Soviet advance made it clear to Japan's leaders that they were facing a two-front war, one that they had no realistic means of sustaining. The Soviet invasion was particularly significant because Japan had long sought to use the Soviet Union as a mediator to negotiate peace terms with the United States and its allies. Since early 1945, Japanese diplomats had been secretly reaching out to Soviet officials in the hope of brokering a settlement that would allow Japan to retain its imperial structure and key territories. However, with the Soviet Union now an active belligerent against Japan, any hope of mediation evaporated overnight. Japan was now completely isolated, and its strategic options had dwindled to near zero. As Soviet tanks rolled through Manchuria and American forces prepared for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, Japan's leadership faced an excruciating dilemma. The divided war cabinet struggled with the decision to surrender, with some military hardliners still advocating for continued resistance. However, the entry of the Soviet Union into the war fundamentally altered the strategic calculus. The fear of a Soviet occupation of Japan, possibly resulting in the installation of a communist regime, deeply troubled the Japanese elite. This fear, coupled with the realization that any further resistance would result in the utter annihilation of Japan, pushed Emperor Hirohito to take an unprecedented step. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation in a historic radio broadcast, announcing Japan's surrender. In his speech, he referenced the new and most cruel bomb as a factor in the decision to capitulate, but historical records indicate that the primary reason was the Soviet invasion and the impossibility of negotiating a more favorable end to the war. By surrendering to the United States rather than allowing the Soviet Union to dictate terms, Japan's leadership sought to preserve what little autonomy they had left. This move ultimately ensured that Japan remained under American occupation rather than falling into the Soviet sphere of influence. The belief that Japan surrendered solely because of the atomic bombings is a simplistic and convenient narrative, one that overlooks the broader geopolitical realities of the time. While the bombings undoubtedly played a role in accelerating Japan's surrender, they were not the decisive factor. The Soviet Union's sudden and aggressive entry into the war shattered Japan's last hopes of securing a negotiated peace and forced its leadership into a decision they had long resisted. The fear of a Soviet occupation and the potential dismantling of the imperial system pushed Japan into the arms of the Americans, ultimately shaping the post-war world order. The real reason Japan surrendered was not merely the terror of nuclear destruction, but the cold, hard realization that it had been strategically outmaneuvered on all fronts. Understanding this truth provides a more nuanced and accurate view of one of the most consequential moments in modern history. It also serves as a reminder that wars do not end with a single event, but are shaped by a complex interplay of military actions, political decisions, and international power struggles.